The courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation, lawyers rustling papers, spectators whispering in hushed tones, and the distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze steady and professional. It was another day, another case, or at least that's what she thought. The bailiff called the case. The State of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the polished oak of the bench. She glanced at the charges in front of her: assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest. Another lost soul, tangled in the system, she thought. When the defendant was brought in, her world tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was James Anderson. Her James. Her throat tightened as a flood of memories surged forward. The summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the magnolia tree in her backyard. The promises they made as kids, to always have each other's backs, no matter what. But the man standing before her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship. Yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to process the impossible. James looked up. His expression was a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything. To demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began their opening statements, Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was James. And somehow, she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present, before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Eleanor's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana, divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence. James's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly. She remembered how they met, an accidental encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard. James had been fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She'd offered to help, and that simple gesture had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Eleanor," he had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars. "You ever think about leaving this place? Like, really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened, despite the whispers. The sideways glances. The outright disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then, one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school when Eleanor's father caught them sitting on the porch together. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. "Eleanor, get inside. Now." She'd hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But they hadn't seen each other again. Not really. Her father forbade her from going near James. And soon after, James's family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into school. Her ambitions carried her far beyond the town of Hammond. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered, what had become of James after she had walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. His record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses. Petty theft. Loitering. Nothing that screamed a violent nature. But then again, how much of someone's life could you see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime. James was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries. The cash register had been emptied. James was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor studied James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched. His hands clasped in front of him. But his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Eleanor a moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant Margaret approached with a hesitant expression. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted." Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be? When the past she buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment. The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbled notes. The clerk shuffled papers. And the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Powell, was ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice firm. "This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register's contents. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical. Detached. As if James were nothing more than a name on a docket. She glanced at James, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. She was young but confident, with a voice that carried across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward. But it's not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story, and that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand. A store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. He described seeing a man fitting James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed. But something about it felt rehearsed. Lisa's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Chambers, you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly. "So, you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no, but—" "No further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat. His shoulders squared. As if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The air in the courtroom felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat with her back straight, hands resting on the polished oak bench, but inside, she was anything but composed. She had trained her whole life to remain impartial. To see the law as a framework built on logic and evidence. And yet, as she looked down at the defendant, she found herself staring at the echoes of her past. James Anderson. A name she hadn't spoken in years. The boy who had once been her best friend now sat before her in shackles. His eyes met hers, just for a moment, and the weight of history between them was almost unbearable. "Mr. Anderson," she said, forcing her voice to remain even. "You stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's lips parted slightly before he finally spoke. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was rougher than she remembered, worn by time and hardship. She swallowed, glancing at the prosecution's table. Richard Powell, the lead prosecutor, adjusted his tie, his expression set in stone. He thrived in cases like this, open and shut convictions where the evidence seemed clear. But Eleanor wasn't sure anything about this case was clear. "Proceed," she said, her fingers tightening slightly around the gavel. The courtroom buzzed as Powell stood, addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with certainty, "this case is about a violent act. A man who entered a convenience store, attacked a clerk, and made off with stolen cash. The evidence, the testimony, the video footage, it will all prove beyond a reasonable doubt that James Anderson is guilty." Eleanor watched as Powell moved deliberately around the courtroom, his words rehearsed, his gestures precise. "But more than that," he continued, "this case is about justice. We cannot allow criminals to walk free, to terrorize innocent people without consequence. James Anderson's actions were deliberate, reckless, and dangerous. And by the end of this trial, you will see that the only just verdict is guilty." James sat still, expressionless. If the words affected him, he didn't show it. Lisa Porter, his defense attorney, rose to her feet. She was younger than Powell, but sharp. She adjusted the lapel of her navy blazer before stepping forward. "The prosecution would like you to believe this case is simple," she said. "But I'm here to tell you that it is not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the start. And while the prosecution may have pieces of evidence, I urge you to look closer. Because what you will find is that there are gaps, glaring inconsistencies that cast doubt on the case against him." She turned toward the jury. "Justice is not about locking up the first person who fits a description. It is about truth. And the truth is, James Anderson did not commit this crime." Eleanor watched the jury's reaction. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others remained unmoved. Would they really be able to see James as a person, rather than just another defendant? As the first witness was called, Eleanor forced herself to focus. Her past with James didn't matter. Not here. Not now. But the past had a way of creeping in. Eleanor couldn't stop the memories from surfacing. The smell of the summer air in Hammond, Louisiana. The feel of warm dirt beneath her bare feet as she and James lay on their backs, staring at the stars. James had always talked about leaving. Getting out of their small town. Becoming something bigger. "People like me don't get second chances," he had said once, his voice quiet. "We gotta fight for everything." She had rolled her eyes back then, too young to fully understand what he meant. She understood now. James had been right. The world hadn't given him second chances. And as she watched him sit there, wrists bound by metal, she wondered, had she ever really done anything to help him? The next day in court, the prosecution brought out surveillance footage. The grainy black and white video flickered onto the screen. A figure in a red hoodie. A struggle. A flash of movement behind the counter. Powell stepped forward, pointing at the screen. "There you have it," he said. The defendant, James Anderson, caught in the act. Lisa Porter stood, arms crossed. "With all due respect, Mr. Powell, that's not what I see." She walked toward the monitor. "This footage is low resolution, unclear. There's no way to positively identify my client from this alone." Powell smirked. "The jury will decide that." Eleanor inhaled slowly. The video was far from conclusive. James's posture stiffened, as if bracing himself. Lisa turned to Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. "Officer Harris," she began, "you stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the crime scene when you detained him. Is that correct?" "That's right," Harris said. "And you arrested him based on what?" "He matched the description given by the store clerk." Lisa tilted her head. "The description being a black male in his 40s, wearing dark clothing?" "Yes." Lisa took a step forward. "The suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession?" Harris hesitated. "No," Lisa nodded. "Did you or any other officer search the surrounding area for discarded clothing?" "No," a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lisa turned back to the jury. "So let's be clear, James Anderson was arrested not because of any concrete evidence, but because he happened to be a black man near the scene of a crime." Powell objected. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Eleanor knew what was coming next. James would testify. She watched as he stood, chains clinking softly as he walked to the stand. "Mr. Anderson," Lisa began, "can you tell the jury where you were the night of the incident?" James's voice was steady. "I was walking home from a friend's house." "Did you enter the convenience store that night?" "No." "Did you rob the store?" "No, ma'am." Lisa nodded, stepping back. "That's all, Your Honor." Powell approached, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Anderson," he said, voice dripping with skepticism. "You have a record, don't you?" James clenched his jaw. "Yes." Powell paced. "A history of petty theft, loitering, resisting arrest. Wouldn't you say you've had trouble with the law?" James's hands tightened into fists. "I've made mistakes. But I didn't do this." Powell smirked. "Of course." He turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget who we're dealing with." Eleanor felt her stomach twist. James wasn't on trial for his past. But Powell wanted to make sure that's all the jury saw. The verdict came after hours of deliberation. Eleanor sat, unmoving, as the foreperson stood. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant," the pause stretched. James barely breathed. "Not guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom. Relief flooded Eleanor's chest. James closed his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. He was free. But as the courtroom emptied, Eleanor knew, this wasn't the end. She met James's gaze one last time. For a brief second, she saw the boy she once knew. Then he turned, walking away, disappearing into the world that had tried to break him. And Eleanor sat there, wondering if justice had truly been served. Or if it had simply come too late.